in the opening phase of this unfolding global crisis. Former U.S. Army officer Douglas Macgregor describes a Middle East situation that is no longer just a regional conflict, but a systemic breakdown of military confidence, strategic assumptions, and geopolitical control, where Israel's once vaunted air and missile defense network is now portrayed as effectively overwhelmed by a new class of Iranian missile capabilities that combine heavy explosive payloads, long-range precision guidance, and a level of survivability that makes traditional interception methods increasingly ineffective. According to this perspective, the key shift is not just volume of fire, but quality and efficiency, where Iran no longer needs to launch hundreds of missiles to achieve strategic impact, but instead can deploy fewer, more precise strikes that penetrate defenses and inflict disproportionate damage on critical infrastructure, military assets, and command nodes, signaling a fundamental change in the economics of warfare. Beneath this escalation lies an even more important structural reality. Large portions of Iran's strategic missile infrastructure and underground facilities remain untouched, particularly in the eastern regions, creating a deep reserve of offensive capacity that is insulated from conventional air campaigns and therefore capable of sustaining prolonged pressure without visible depletion. This creates a psychological and strategic imbalance, where one side appears to be operating within the limits of exposure and attrition, while the other retains hidden depth and endurance, forcing adversaries to reconsider whether their current strategies are even capable of producing meaningful outcomes. As this military imbalance develops, early political signals begin to emerge from Washington suggesting uncertainty and fatigue, with some voices allegedly advocating for a symbolic declaration of victory followed by withdrawal rather than continued escalation, reflecting a growing awareness that the conflict may not have a traditional endpoint. In this framing, the battlefield situation is no longer isolated from economic reality, because every additional exchange of missiles and counterstrikes feeds directly into a broader global system already under strain from inflationary pressure, energy insecurity, sovereign debt fragility, and declining confidence in reserve currencies, making the war not just a military contest, but a trigger mechanism for global instability. This intersection between battlefield dynamics and economic vulnerability sets the stage for what follows, where the conflict is no longer measured solely in territorial or tactical gains, but in its capacity to reshape global energy markets, financial flows, and the underlying architecture of international power. As the conflict expands beyond the battlefield, the narrative shifts into what Macgregor describes as a deeper systemic breakdown of global economic stability, where war is no longer an isolated geopolitical event, but a direct threat to the financial foundations that support the modern international order. In this view, rising energy prices are not temporary market fluctuations, but symptoms of structural disruption amplified by uncertainty in Middle Eastern supply chains and the increasing vulnerability of critical infrastructure that underpins global oil and gas flows. At the center of this system sits the long-standing petrodollar mechanism, a financial architecture in which global oil sales are predominantly denominated in US dollars and recycled back into American financial instruments such as treasury bonds, effectively sustaining U.S. fiscal flexibility and global monetary influence, but which is now portrayed as weakening under geopolitical fragmentation and distrust. As this system erodes, the implications extend far beyond energy markets, because any disruption in oil distribution or pricing stability reverberates through inflation rates, industrial production, transportation costs, and sovereign debt servicing across multiple continents, creating a chain reaction that no single state can fully control. Within this environment, the war is described as having already rendered significant portions of regional oil production effectively offline, not necessarily through total physical destruction, but through instability, risk avoidance, insurance collapse, and logistical breakdowns that make normal operations impossible for extended periods. This transforms energy infrastructure into a strategic battleground where even the threat of targeting key terminals or refineries becomes enough to alter global behavior, pricing, and diplomatic alignment. Escalating warnings suggest that if critical nodes such as major Gulf export facilities were attacked, the response could trigger a reciprocal destruction of energy infrastructure across the region, creating a feedback loop of retaliation that would not remain localized but would instead propagate through global markets, potentially pushing economies already under stress toward recession or even deeper contraction. In this scenario, even traditionally stable alliances become uncertain as regional actors reassess whether external security guarantees are credible in a world where missile penetration, saturation attacks, and asymmetric warfare challenge the effectiveness of advanced defense systems. The result is a widening sense that economic stability and military stability are no longer separate domains, but interconnected vulnerabilities feeding into one another, amplifying the risk that continued escalation could produce consequences far beyond the original scope of the conflict. As the narrative continues, McGregor's perspective shifts from immediate battlefield and economic disruption to a broader geopolitical indictment of how the war itself was conceived, arguing that the underlying problem is not simply miscalculation, but a fundamental absence of coherent strategy in Washington, where long-term objectives were never clearly defined and political decision-making was driven more by assumptions of quick compliance than by realistic assessments of Iranian resilience. In this framing, Iran is described not as a fragile state susceptible to external pressure, but as a deeply rooted civilizational power with thousands of years of continuity, capable of absorbing shocks, adapting under pressure, and maintaining internal cohesion even in the face of sustained external hostility. This historical framing is used to challenge the assumption that economic sanctions, military strikes, or political isolation can produce rapid regime change, instead suggesting that such measures often produce the opposite effect by consolidating national identity and hardening resistance against perceived external aggression. As the argument develops, it is asserted that maximalist demands placed on Iran, ranging from restrictions on nuclear activity to limitations on missile development and regional influence, are structurally unrealistic, especially when tied to external political expectations that are perceived as non-negotiable or externally imposed. This, in turn, creates a situation where diplomacy becomes increasingly difficult because any proposed settlement is interpreted not as compromise, but as coercion, leaving little room for mutual trust or gradual de-escalation. Meanwhile, neighboring Gulf states are portrayed as being trapped in a strategic dilemma, having historically relied on external powers for security guarantees, while simultaneously engaging in complex financial and diplomatic relationships that require balancing multiple competing interests. However, as the credibility of external protection is questioned by ongoing missile penetrations and regional instability, these states are forced to reassess long-standing assumptions about deterrence, investment security, and long-term alignment. The result is an increasingly fragmented regional landscape where traditional alliances are no longer sufficient to guarantee stability and where every actor must reconsider its exposure to a conflict that is no longer confined to borders, but is spilling into economic systems, infrastructure, networks, and political relationships across the entire region. The narrative then escalates into a more strategic and deeply alarming assessment of modern warfare, where the central argument is that the balance of military power is shifting away from traditional superiority models toward industrial capacity, endurance, and missile economics, fundamentally changing how wars are fought and won. Macgregor's perspective emphasizes that advanced missile defense systems, while technologically sophisticated, are increasingly being overwhelmed by cost asymmetry, where expensive interceptor missiles are forced to counter far cheaper offensive projectiles, creating a mathematical disadvantage that becomes unsustainable over time, especially in prolonged conflicts. This dynamic is compounded by claims that Western stockpiles of precision-guided munitions are under strain due to prior commitments in other theaters, particularly Ukraine, where high-cost interceptors and advanced missiles have allegedly been expended at rates that outpace replenishment, raising concerns about readiness for enemy with expanded conflict. In contrast, adversaries are portrayed as having invested heavily over decades in large-scale missile production capacity, enabling sustained barrages designed not necessarily for immediate breakthrough, but for exhaustion of defensive systems through attrition. This shift in warfare logic means that victory is no longer determined solely by technological superiority, but by the ability to outproduce and outlast the opponent in sustained industrial output, a domain where different global powers possess fundamentally different advantages. China, in particular, is described as having a massive industrial base capable of producing missile components and propulsion systems at scale far exceeding Western production rates, reinforcing the idea that future conflicts could be decided by manufacturing throughput rather than battlefield tactics. This comparison leads to a broader critique of Western military doctrine, which is portrayed as optimized for short, high-intensity, technologically dominant engagements rather than prolonged wars of attrition against near-peer industrial competitors. Historically, this mindset is illustrated through past conflicts such as Vietnam and World War II, where reliance on air power alone failed to achieve strategic objectives without ground force deployment, reinforcing the argument that assumptions of war from a distance consistently underestimate the necessity and vulnerability of sustained ground operations. In the present context, however, even large-scale ground deployments are described as increasingly risky due to the proliferation of surveillance systems, satellite reconnaissance, and precision-guided strike capabilities, which would expose and target troop concentrations rapidly and at scale. As a result, the traditional model of force projection becomes more dangerous and less effective, forcing a reassessment of what military power actually means in an era where visibility, precision, and industrial output converge to redefine both offense and defense in ways that make prolonged escalation significantly more costly and uncertain than in previous decades. In the final phase of this expanded narrative, the focus shifts from military economics and regional instability to the most extreme strategic and psychological risks of escalation, where Macgregor warns that once conventional deterrence systems begin to fail, the conflict can enter a dangerously unpredictable phase in which decision makers may feel cornered into considering options that would previously have been unthinkable. Within this framework, the erosion of missile defense credibility, the exhaustion of stockpiles, and the inability to achieve decisive battlefield outcomes all combine to create a pressure environment where political leaders face narrowing choices and increasing incentives for escalation rather than compromise. The argument suggests that as mutual vulnerability increases, the threshold for miscalculation decreases, meaning that a single strike, misinterpreted signal, or retaliatory cycle could trigger a chain reaction far beyond the original scope of the conflict. At the highest end of this risk spectrum lies the possibility presented as a warning rather than a prediction of catastrophic escalation involving nuclear-capable states in the region, where desperation or perceived existential threat could push actors toward irreversible decisions with global consequences. Even if such scenarios remain unlikely, their mere presence reshapes strategic calculations, because all sides must now factor in not just victory or defeat, but survival under conditions of extreme escalation, uncertainty. Alongside this military danger is a parallel political critique where leadership decisions are portrayed as being influenced by external alliances, domestic pressures, and long-standing geopolitical commitments that limit flexibility and make disengagement difficult, even when strategic costs become apparent. This creates a paradox where actors may recognize the unsustainability of continued escalation, yet lack a clear pathway to exit without political or reputational loss, effectively locking them into a cycle of managed escalation rather than resolution. Ultimately, the overarching conclusion of this narrative is that the conflict is no longer about a single region or adversary, but about a broader transition in global order, where economic systems, military doctrines, and political assumptions are all being tested simultaneously, and where the outcome is less likely to resemble a decisive victory than a prolonged restructuring of power, stability, and influence in an increasingly fragmented international landscape. In this continuation of the narrative, the focus deepens into the idea that the current geopolitical crisis is not merely a sequence of military escalations, but a breakdown of trust in the entire framework of post-Cold War international order, where alliances, deterrence guarantees, and economic interdependence are no longer sufficient to prevent large-scale conflict. McGregor's framing suggests that what is collapsing is not just battlefield stability, but the assumption that superior technology, financial dominance, and diplomatic pressure can reliably shape outcomes in complex regional conflicts involving deeply entrenched historical identities. Instead, the situation is portrayed as a convergence of multiple failures, strategic misjudgment, industrial imbalance, and political overreach that together create a system where escalation becomes easier than de-escalation. Within this environment, even attempts at negotiation are described as structurally constrained because each side interprets concessions through the lens of survival rather than compromise, making diplomatic off-ramps increasingly narrow and politically costly. At the same time, regional actors are depicted as reevaluating their long-term alignment strategies, recognizing that dependence on external security guarantees may no longer provide the stability it once promised, especially in a context where missile proliferation and asymmetric warfare reduce the effectiveness of traditional defense architectures. This leads to a gradual fragmentation of previously stable blocs as economic interests, security concerns, and ideological alignments begin to diverge under the pressure of sustained conflict. Meanwhile, global markets react not just to physical disruptions in energy infrastructure, but to the perception of systemic instability, where uncertainty itself becomes a driving force behind capital movement, inflation expectations, and investment withdrawal. In this sense, the war becomes self-reinforcing as economic fear accelerates political tension, which in turn increases military risk, creating a feedback loop that is difficult to interrupt through conventional diplomatic means. The result is a strategic environment in which all actors operate under compressed timelines, reduced trust, and heightened sensitivity to perceived threats, making even minor incidents potentially catalytic for broader escalation. Ultimately, this phase of the narrative emphasizes that the core danger is not a single decisive confrontation, but a prolonged erosion of stabilizing mechanisms where the absence of clear victory conditions leaves all participants navigating uncertainty in a system that is gradually losing its capacity to regulate conflict. In this stage of the narrative, the discussion moves toward a broader historical and ideological critique of how Western power has been exercised in the Middle East, with McGregor arguing that repeated interventionist strategies have not produced stable political outcomes, but instead have generated cycles of resistance, fragmentation, and long-term instability that outlast the original military operations. From this perspective, regime change is portrayed less as a coherent policy objective and more as a recurring pattern of overconfidence in the ability of external force to reshape deeply rooted political and cultural systems, where initial tactical success is often followed by strategic failure once occupation, governance, and legitimacy challenges emerge. Historical examples are invoked to reinforce this pattern, suggesting that interventions in places like Afghanistan and Iraq resulted not in durable alignment with Western objectives, but in prolonged instability and the eventual reassertion of local or previously opposing forces, highlighting the limits of military power in achieving political transformation. This critique extends to earlier conflicts as well, where air campaigns and sanctions are described as insufficient tools for forcing regime collapse when underlying social cohesion strengthens in response to external pressure. Within the current Iran-centered scenario, this logic is applied to argue that sustained pressure may actually consolidate internal unity as populations and political factions set aside differences in response to perceived external threats, thereby reducing the likelihood of internal fragmentation or externally induced regime change. Simultaneously, regional perception of the United States and its allies is described as shifting, with growing skepticism about the consistency, effectiveness, and long-term sustainability of security commitments, particularly in environments where non-state actors and missile-based deterrence strategies can challenge even advanced military systems. This evolving perception contributes to a recalibration of alliances where states begin hedging their positions rather than fully aligning with any single power bloc, increasing diplomatic complexity and reducing predictability in regional behavior. Economically, this uncertainty feeds into global markets through fluctuating energy expectations, risk premiums, and capital reallocation, reinforcing the idea that geopolitical instability is now inseparable from financial volatility. Ultimately, this phase of the narrative underscores a central theme: that repeated reliance on force as a primary instrument of policy has produced diminishing returns, and that in the absence of adaptable political frameworks capable of absorbing complexity, interventions risk generating consequences that extend far beyond their intended scope.